Welcome back to Sika Strength, welcome back to Sika Stand. Today we're talking about squats for taller people.
Push!
I know most of you love watching squats, you love the idea of having a big squat, but as a taller athlete, particularly with longer legs, it can be quite difficult to make your squat look like someone like Owen or someone like Tian Tao. In this case, it is not impossible to have a very, very good squat, very respectable weights with a nice movement pattern, but there are certain aspects that the taller athlete needs to pay a bit more attention to. So squats are deeply personal. We want the barbell to be significantly heavy where it means something to us. We want it to move well with a nice amount of speed. And we also want the positions to emulate the positions of the very good squatters we're used to watching. Technically speaking, to do a good squat, we only need a couple of things. We need to keep the barbell over our base of support, and we need to get our hips below parallel. That's it. It's really not any more complicated than that. Yet when I show you the next couple of videos, I think you're going to be objectively able to say this squat is better than that one, even though the weights will be almost identical. So the first squat we have here is a 200 kilo squat. It's the first time I ever hit 200 kilos. It's donkeys years ago now at this point, but I think you'll notice that this isn't a very good looking squat. Now, this isn't a very good looking squat primarily because the barbell almost stops moving on the way up. So the tempo overall isn't great. There's something that some powerlifters might refer to as a sticking point. And overall, it's not a very nice looking or aesthetic looking squat. This mainly doesn't look nice because my knees shoot back quite early and my hips go back and I get this big torso inclination forward. For most taller athletes, this is going to be the main flaw in your squatting technique. And what we're going to dive into now is how to get rid of this and stop it from happening. Here we've a 215 kilo back squat. A quick note on this, at this point my squat was significantly higher than this, so this is around 90% of my squat 1RM. So it's natural that this is going to look easier, the speed will be a bit better, it'll be a bit more of a free flowing movement as I go through it. But what I really want you to pay attention to here is the knees staying forward and my hips staying forward as I stand back up. So a certain amount of torso inclination is absolutely natural. It will happen even for somebody as genetically talented in their morphology as Liu Xiaojun. You're going to have a small bit of forward torso lean. But in this case, you'll see I counteract that torso lean very well by being able to keep my knees forward, keep my quads engaged, and stop my hips from shooting back as I stand up out of the bottom position. Now, these positions and how I chase getting better at them is a three-pronged approach. So the first thing I have to do is I have to get stronger legs. Most people who are taller will tend to have a posterior bias, so their hamstrings, their glutes, their back will tend to be a lot stronger than their quads. And this is made even more pronounced when they start strength training because naturally their hips will sit further back. Naturally their shins will come to vertical a small bit quicker. And so because of that, I start off with a posterior bias and then I keep leaning or leaning into that bias more and more. What you're going to have to do is have a very, very well thought out and prescribed leg strength program to get you through this initial stage. If you immediately went and started squatting in the patterns that you wanted to squat in, you'll probably find you're able to do about 60 to 70% of your original 1RM number, and that's not sustainable. What you're going to have to do is have a very pronounced period of accessory training, a very much prioritized leg and quad strength block, and then this should allow you to come back to those old 1RM numbers and surpass them easily. There are a couple of ways we really focus on leg strength here. The first thing you have to look at is building work capacity in the legs themselves. Most of us will be able to do a somewhat decent squat with around 65 to 70% of our 1RM, and it will look pretty good. I'll be able to keep that upright torso, I'll be able to keep my knees forward and my quads engaged. But once I start getting higher than that in terms of the weight, or once I start deviating above 3 to 5 reps, I'll really start to notice those positions breaking down. So not only do my quads not have the absolute strength to contract hard enough for my maximal 1RM numbers, they also just don't have the work capacity to be able to keep themselves in the race in those high rep sets. What's that mean for us? Well, we start off with that higher volume working sets at the beginning of our strength cycle, and we'll actually keep that high volume work in there for a long time with the leg accessory pieces. The second thing you're going to have to do once you start building that work capacity, gaining some hypertrophy in the quads, you're really going to have to look to actually train that motor pattern. Now, training that motor pattern is quite difficult, particularly if we're just using the standard squat to get there, because all the things I've previously mentioned are going to push you back towards your old style, your old technique, those motor patterns that are probably well ingrained at this point. There are a few things we use to get people past this point. The first thing we use is heels raised, narrower stance squats. Now, I'm saying narrower stance. What I'm really looking for here is my heels to be raised and my toes to be pointing almost straight forward. This will allow for the maximum amount of forward knee travel, and it will give me a very good feeling for how that weight distribution changes throughout the squat. Generally speaking, we'll get people to start off here with a goblet squat or a belt squat. It just allows me to keep the weight out in front of me a small bit more, and it makes that upright torso a small bit more easy to obtain. So if you don't have a belt squat machine, I'd recommend getting a dip belt or a general weightlifting belt and tying some plates around it. But you can also do it with a goblet squat. You can also do it with a big heavy medicine ball being held in the front rack. Any of these things where you're pushing the knees forward and keeping them forward throughout the entire set. Another great tool for training that knees forward position is a shallower squat in that narrower, more toes forward stance. This is by no means something that you're going to be bringing in and holding onto for a long time, but certainly when you start transitioning out of those goblet style squats and maybe you've reached the maximum amount of weight for holding 2 kettlebells, maybe the heaviest kettlebell in your gym is 32 kilos and 64 kilos here isn't quite triggering that drive in your quads as much as it should be. Put the barbell on your back and start going to that slightly narrower stance and just above parallel. Now, the just above parallel allows us to do two things. The first thing is it allows us to keep our hips forward because we never reach that point where our hips are furthest away in that kind of perpendicular line from the floor, right? So our hips never deviate too far back. The second thing it allows me to do is allows me to keep squatting down as long as my knees are moving forward. Now, this is something we're going to talk about a small bit later on, but ankle mobility is a major factor, particularly for taller athletes, and ankle mobility is something that takes quite a while to obtain. So as we're going through our strength block and building capacity in our quads, we mightn't necessarily have the requisite increase in ankle mobility that we need. And so we raise our heels and we can make those squats slightly shallower for a brief period of time, still get that great training effect as the ankle mobility starts to catch up. The final thing about those slightly shallower squats is it allows you to keep that tension in your quads throughout the entire rep. So a lot of the time as we bounce into that bottom position or as we go through that parallel and below parallel range, we'll start to lose tension in our quads, and this can be a problem because once we lose that tension in our quads, our body will automatically shoot the knees back, shoot our hips back to put a bit more of the load and tension on our posterior chain, and we lose that training effect because of it. Once again, before I move on, this is not a long-term training strategy, but it is something which will allow you to really gain a lot of work capacity in your quads while also start pushing you in the way of learning that motor pattern for a really quadsy knees forward squat. Moving on from this then is something I've mentioned earlier, and that is mobility. So usually if we're looking for a better quality squat, particularly if we've longer legs, we're going to focus mainly on 3 areas. The first one, and this is by far the most important one, is ankle mobility. Having more ankle mobility will always be better. I'm not sure why it is, I'm not sure what the mechanism behind it is, but generally speaking, when we see taller athletes, they have poorer ankle mobility. I'm not sure if that's necessary rigidity that comes from having those slightly longer levers, but generally speaking, longer tibias make for poorer ankle mobility. What are we going to recommend for this? Well, ankles need a lot of load going through them. If you're used to taking 10,000 steps a day, those calves, that Achilles tendon unit is going to be very, very strong. So just holding a kind of semi-hard stretch isn't really going to do anything for it. Usually we're talking about loading up with kind of, if it's a bent knee ankle mobility stretch, I'm probably going to have minimum 15 kilos, but realistically 25 kilos on top of my knee as I'm pushing that knee forward over my toe. If I'm doing a body weight variation, like maybe I'm standing on a step and hanging my heel down over it, I'll try and push myself down. So if I can hold on to the edge of a squat rack and really push myself down, I'll do that. But I'm really looking to put a lot of load through that calf and Achilles tendon unit. I'm not looking to be tearing anything. I'm not looking for extreme pain, but moderate discomfort is certainly something I'm looking for in those stretches. The second thing that comes along with ankle mobility is I need to be doing those holds for a long time. For the exact same reasons we talked about you needing a lot of load through the tendon, I need to be holding that load for a long time. For that reason, we generally say 90 seconds to 2 minutes is about the minimum threshold for one set of ankle mobility or ankle stretches. If I'm going to be doing that in the evening before I go to bed, I'm probably looking at 3 to 5 sets of 90 seconds on each side. It's going to take a small bit of time, so I definitely recommend opening up your laptop and putting on Netflix, or maybe doing some emails on your phone as you're doing it. These are definitely stretches you can hold for a long time. They're not incredibly strenuous. They don't put you in a weird position, so you can get a lot of other stuff done as you're stretching your ankles out. The final thing then with ankle mobility is you need to be doing it frequently. Doing this once or twice per week just is not going to get the effect you need, particularly if you're somebody like me who really struggled with that ankle mobility. It took me about 6 months of weekly physical therapy and stretching my ankles every day just to be able to achieve the positions you saw in the bad videos at the start of this. So it is something you have to be doing every day. Just make it part of your training cool down, or make it part of your nightly or morning ritual. Just get the ankle mobility done, tick that box, and you'll be well on your way to getting a better squat. The second aspect of mobility we have to look at then is hip mobility. So usually what we're going to be lacking is external rotation in the hips. This comes with the caveat that if you're somebody who really squats with your knees pushing out to the side and you're really in this kind of hip dominant wider stance squat at the moment, you're probably not going to be lacking external rotation in your hips. But what I'm going to look for here is just better hip mobility. Internal, external, flexion and extension. I want my hips to be a small bit more open. Now, why do I want this? The first reason I want this is it's going to make my bottom position far easier to obtain, and it's going to be less likely that I'll bounce out of that bottom position or reactively move out of that bottom position in a way where my hips are unloading straight away. So take these two different squats, the good one and the bad one, the vertical torso versus the bent over good morning squat. In the vertical torso squat position, as I hit the bottom, I'm in a large amount of flexion. My hips are really in that kind of restricted position. In the bent over squat, you could have slightly more flexion depending on your relative lever lengths, but you're really not going to be taxing those hips all too much. What I would say here is, generally speaking, when we see people with tight hips, as they hit the bottom position of the squat, particularly when they're under a lot of load, they'll tend to kick their hips back a small bit more. So what are you looking for here? I would be joining this in with your ankle mobility routine, and I'd just be looking to open your hips up. So getting down into that push-up position, bringing that right foot up alongside your right hand, dropping your elbow down to the floor, opening up the inside of that hip can do massive benefits. Also, if you're anybody who sits down at a desk during the day, you certainly need to be looking at your hip flexors. So something like a couch stretch or a band distracted couch stretch will be very beneficial here. The last aspect of mobility is a somewhat forgotten aspect of mobility, particularly for the high bar vertical torso squat, and that is having better shoulder and upper back mobility. Generally speaking, if I can bring my hands in a bit narrower, have a better stacked rack position for that barbell, I'm going to be far better off. Something we talk about commonly on the channel here in training camps and at seminars is the idea of this hybrid squat position, the mid-bar position. So the barbell is not in a low bar position, but what I do is I put the barbell across the widest portion of my back. For most of us, if we palpate our shoulder here, you'll feel that bony process on the back of your rotator cuff. Aim to sit the barbell in that position. Now, why does shoulder mobility really affect me here? Well, for people with tighter shoulders, you're going to struggle to get your hands into that position to maintain that good shelf for the barbell, and because of that, you'll have to go slightly wider. Now, being slightly wider, I'm both weaker in my upper back, so I'm weaker to try and extend my upper back into that good position, but I'm also going to be more likely to lean forward as I stand up out of that bottom position. So stack your hands in closer, get that chest in a more upright position, and that back will be much more able to resist tilting forward as you stand up out of the bottom position. Okay, so you're going to be training your legs, you're going to be opening up your hips, your ankles, and your shoulders to maintain those better positions or to achieve them in the first place. And the final thing you have to do as a taller athlete looking for a better squat is have better midline control. What I'm talking about here with midline control is both anterior and posterior core strength. Most of us are very good as we start off strength training doing our isometrics. We'll do all of our accessories, we'll listen to everything our coach says or our program prescribes. But as we get further and further into strength training, or particularly as we get further and further into a long strength training block, we'll tend to neglect our accessories a bit more. Now, as the taller person, you're going to be more likely to kick your hips back, more likely to get that forward torso inclination, and then more likely to have far more leverage on that trunk than you will if you have a super upright stacked position. I'm not talking about doing a huge amount of training volume here. What I'm really looking at doing is doing some anterior, some posterior, and some anti-rotational isometric work, probably 2 or 3 times per week, or what you can generally say is do one of those in each training session you're going to do. So start off very simple, start off with the very, very basic progressions, whether that's planks in a push-up position or planks on your elbows for the anterior work. For the posterior work, start off with some prone back extension holds. They'll do very, very well for most of your training. Even if your back is incredibly strong and you feel like your glutes could get a bit more, then a glute bridge hold will be very good here. And for the anti-rotational work, just start off with something like a side plank. You can bring in peel-off press and all those other great things later on, but start at the very basic level. Now, where do we go with our isometrics? This is a really common question. How do I progress my isometrics? My main piece of advice here would be build up to around 90 seconds of a hold in any of these positions and then increase the difficulty you're going to be doing. So I know I'll do 3 to 5 sets or maybe 4 to 6 sets depending on what kind of athlete you are. Once you know you're going to do that amount of sets, start off with 15, 20, 30-second holds depending on where you're starting off. Build that up to around 90 seconds, just making 5 to 10 second increases from week to week. Once you then achieve that 90-second hold in any of those positions, you're just going to go to a slightly more difficult version of that thing. So maybe I'm starting on my elbows for the plank, I'm going to go out into a Superman plank position. Maybe I'm doing a prone back extension hold. Now I'm going to do a prone back extension with my heels kicked in underneath something and I'm really raising my upper body off the floor. So any of these things, we're looking to progress it, make the difficulty increase slightly. This is a very, very basic form of progressing intensity. And now I'm going to achieve 90 seconds in that next one and gradually move up the ladder as you go through. If you'd like more information like this, please sign up to the Sika Strength newsletter. Pick which area you're really interested in, whether it's weightlifting, strength training, hybrid training, S&C for sport, Sika Strength newsletter, general. Pick any of those, pick all of them. You'll get really good information written by myself and Owen every single week, and hopefully it'll give you better tools with which to address your strength training.